So our final question for this evening is coming from Gary in Provo, who would like to ask about what it means to compromise. So Gary, you're on the line.
Hi, Senator Lee. Really appreciate you taking my call. I'm just wondering, in the last Republican primary, there was so much benefit, so much stress put on being conservative, and just how important it was to be conservative and to stick to that, and to be rigid on and be conservative. Whoever was the most conservative was the one who was praised the most. But there's got to be a way of compromise too. Where do you draw the line between compromise and sticking to your conservative values or whatever?
Okay, Gary, I'm glad you raised this question. This comes up a lot, and I think it's an important issue to address. First of all, we have to remember that compromise is not an outcome. It's not a substantive solution. It is an inevitability in any legislative process that involves more than one person. So if you're Raul Castro or Kim Jong-un or some other dictator, you don't ever have to compromise because your legislative body consists of one person. Your executive authority is also vested in the same person. But if you're part of a legislative body that involves more than one person, you're going to have to compromise. And so the critical question becomes not whether to compromise, but where and how and when, and where and whether and when not to compromise. It's interesting, Gary, I get a lot of calls in my office. And there's one group of callers on this issue that will say, please compromise. Compromise anytime you get the chance. Compromise in a box, with a fox, in the rain, on a train, anywhere, everywhere. Compromise every time you get the chance. There's another group of calls that will come in and say, don't ever compromise. Avoid it like the plague. It's horrible. And I think the point is that both sets of callers on these two extremes end up missing the point. That compromise is an inevitability. It is not a substantive outcome. And the question just involves where you're going to compromise and where you're not going to. What very often passes for compromise in Washington is not, in fact, compromise at all, but collusion. Collusion exists where two or more parties get together and they come up with a solution that protects the decision makers, but it harms other people. And that's very often what happens in Washington. Legislators will get together, senators and congressmen, and they'll make decisions, Republicans and Democrats, that are designed not to benefit the American people, but to benefit themselves, to make it easier for themselves to stay in office longer, to make it easier for themselves to avoid criticism in the press. This is collusion, and this is wrong. And so that's why I think the question is not whether or not to compromise, it's where to compromise and how to avoid collusion. And the best way of defining that is to ask yourself as a lawmaker, am I doing this to benefit myself politically, to make it easier for me to avoid criticism, to make it easier for me to get reelected, or am I doing this to benefit my constituents? Sometimes those interests will align, but where they don't, I think it's incumbent upon the elected official to make the decision that will inure to the benefit of those that he or she represents.